She never said a word, just sat there, eyes down, while the others laughed. No one knew her name. No one cared. But when one man stepped forward, everything changed. And a minute later, they were the ones begging for forgiveness. Before we begin, if stories of quiet courage, unexpected kindness, and the healing power of love speak to you, consider subscribing. Your support helps us share more true-to-heart tales like this one. Now let me tell you what really happened that day, and how a single dad rewrote the ending for a girl the world tried to forget. The knock was so soft, Thomas almost thought he imagined it. It was barely audible over the hum of the old refrigerator and the rustle of late autumn wind skimming dry leaves across the porch. He looked up from the kitchen table where he'd been nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee, his third that day, and stared at the front door, waiting. Nothing. Just silence. He shook his head and reached for his notepad, a half-written grocery list in his scrawled handwriting staring back at him. But then it came again, a knock this time, a bit firmer, still hesitant, still uncertain. Thomas stood the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. He made his way to the door, feeling the familiar twinge in his knees as he moved. The late afternoon sun cast long, golden streaks across the floor, bathing the entryway in an amber warmth that didn't quite reach his chest. He opened the door. And there she was. A girl, maybe 11 or 12, sat curled tightly on the top step of the porch. Her knees were drawn to her chest, arms wrapped around them, and she wore a faded pink sweater, 2 sizes too big. Her jeans were dusty, the knees worn thin, and her dark hair hung in limp strands around her face. A canvas bag sat beside her, weathered and frayed. She didn't look up. For a moment, Thomas just stared, unsure if she was real. She looked like something out of a memory. He didn't know he had something fragile, ghost-like, and far too quiet. "Can I help you?" he finally asked. Still nothing. Not even a flinch. He crouched slowly, careful with his movements, so as not to scare her. "Hey," he said softly. "I'm Thomas. Do you need something? Are you lost?" The girl lifted her eyes just slightly. They were deep brown, large, and haunting eyes that had seen far more than they should have. She didn't speak, but the look in her eyes held a story he couldn't begin to unravel. From inside the house, Henry's voice called out, "Dad." "Who is it?" Thomas glanced back toward the hallway. "Just a minute, bud." Then he turned back to the girl. "Can you tell me your name?" She hesitated, then slowly pulled a folded piece of paper from her bag and held it out. Her hands were trembling. He took it. The handwriting was neat, delicate. It said, "This is Isabel. Her mother was detained. She has no other family. Please help her. Lucia Mendez, caseworker. Call me 323-555-7291. Thomas read the note twice, then again. His jaw tightened slightly. He looked at the girl again, Isabel. Her name felt soft on his tongue, though he didn't speak it aloud. No other family. He stood heart-pounding in a way he hadn't felt in years, not from fear or adrenaline, but from something deeper. A weight, a responsibility he hadn't asked for, but couldn't turn away from. "You hungry?" he asked. Isabel blinked slowly. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. Thomas stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Come in. It's warmer inside." She rose with caution movements, hesitant, as though afraid her presence might shatter something. She stepped past him, small and silent, and he noticed the way her shoes, once white, were nearly gray from dust. She smelled faintly of earth and old fabric softener. As she crossed the threshold, he couldn't help but feel that something sacred had just entered the house. Henry stood at the hallway, eyes wide. "Who's she?" Thomas motioned gently. "This is Isabel. She'll be staying with us. For a little while." Henry, always the cautious one, tilted his head. "Does she talk?" Thomas paused. Not yet. That night dinner was quiet. Thomas made grilled cheese and tomato soup, comfort food he hoped would offer more than just nourishment. Isabel ate slowly with small bites, never making a sound. Henry watched her curiosity etched across his face, but he didn't press. Afterward, Thomas laid a blanket and pillow on the small couch in the den. "You can sleep here tonight," he said. "It's not much, but it's warm." Isabel nodded once and sat down, curling into herself, as though trying to disappear. Thomas lingered at the doorway, uncertain. He thought about asking if she needed anything, but something about her stillness told him she wouldn't answer. So he simply said, "Good night." She didn't respond. But when he turned off the light and walked down the hall, he heard it, the faintest whisper, so soft he almost missed it. "Thank you." He stopped in his tracks, heart catching in his throat. He didn't turn around, didn't want to startle her. But he smiled. A small, aching smile that hadn't touched his lips in a long, long time. And in that moment, something shifted. Not loudly, not drastically, but the silence in his house didn't feel so heavy anymore. The next morning arrived draped in a heavy mist. Thomas stared out the kitchen window, watching the fog cling to the trees like ghosts that refused to leave. His coffee sat cooling in his hands, untouched. In the distance, he could hear the rattle of the school bus turning at the end of the gravel road, but inside the house everything was still. Too still. He turned from the window and glanced toward the hallway. Isabel hadn't stirred. Henry, on the other hand, was already at the table, spooning dry cereal into his mouth with the robotic motions of a child half awake. He wasn't used to having guests, especially not ones who barely spoke. "You think she's okay?" Henry asked between bites. Thomas sighed. "I don't know, bud. She said thank you last night," Henry added thoughtfully, lowering his spoon. "I heard her." Thomas looked at his son, surprised. "You did?" Henry nodded. "Kinda. It was quiet, but it made me feel like she's not so scared of us." Thomas offered a small smile. "Yeah, me too." Moments later, they heard soft footsteps, the sound of bare feet on wood, and Isabel appeared at the hallway's edge. She was wearing the same clothes as yesterday, her hair slightly tousled, eyes wide and watchful. Thomas straightened. "Morning." She dipped her head slightly in response. No words, but there was something in her posture, less rigid, less curled in, that felt like progress. "There's cereal if you're hungry," he said, gesturing to the table. Isabel stepped forward hesitantly and took the seat across from Henry, her movements careful, as though trying not to take up too much space. Henry pushed the box toward her, then added a clean spoon beside her bowl. No one said anything more, but the gesture was louder than any greeting. Thomas stood back for a moment and watched them. Two children, strangers only yesterday, now eating in silence under the same roof. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was something. By noon, Thomas had called the number from the note. Lucia, the caseworker, answered with a tired voice but kind tone. She confirmed everything. Isabel's mother had been detained during a workplace raid. No papers, no relatives willing to take the girl. The only reason Isabel hadn't ended up in the system was because Lucia remembered Thomas and his late wife from their volunteer work at the community center. "She trusted you," Lucia had said softly. "Said if anything ever happened to her, you were the kind of man who'd do the right thing." Thomas had no response to that, not right away. After he hung up, he sat in the living room for nearly an hour, just staring at the cold fireplace. He didn't feel like the right man for anything anymore. Since his wife died, he'd been barely functioning, just enough to take care of Henry, pay the bills, and keep moving. But Lucia's words clung to him like the fog outside. Maybe it was time to open the windows again. That afternoon, he went to the closet in the back of the hallway. It hadn't been opened in over a year. Inside, beneath a pile of winter blankets and forgotten shoes, was a wooden box with brass hinges. He pulled it out, brushed off the dust, and opened the lid. Inside lay his wife's ukulele. Her fingers had once danced on these strings every Sunday morning, filling their house with melody and warmth. She used to say music could speak what words couldn't. Maybe that's what Isabel needed, something that didn't require grammar or perfect pronunciation. Just feeling. He brought the ukulele into the living room and set it on the couch. That evening after dinner, leftover lasagna and awkward glances, Thomas motioned for Isabel to follow him. He sat on the old armchair by the window and gently lifted the ukulele into his lap. She sat cross-legged on the floor, watching him closely. "This belonged to my wife," he said. "She was a music teacher. She believed every person has a sound inside them that's waiting to come out. Doesn't have to be words." Isabel tilted her head, curious. He played a few simple chords. Nothing fancy. Just a soft, gentle melody that rose and fell like a lullaby. Isabel's eyes softened. For the first time, Thomas saw her shoulders drop slightly. Then timidly, almost as if afraid, she reached forward and touched the strings. Thomas smiled. "Go ahead. Try." She plucked a note. It rang out imperfect, but real. Then another. And another. A quiet filled the room, not the kind of silence that isolates, but one that connects. The kind that wraps itself around two people and says, "You don't need to talk to be heard." Later that night, Thomas stood in the doorway of the den watching Isabel sleep. The ukulele lay beside her, and for the first time, her body wasn't curled into a protective shell. She looked at peace. From behind him, Henry whispered, "Do you think she'll be okay?" Thomas placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "I think she's already better than yesterday. That's something." The house was still, but not empty. The air felt different, not loud, not bustling, but alive in a quiet way, like a home just beginning to remember what it felt like to be whole. The first real test came on Monday morning. The fog had lifted, but the sky remained overcast as Thomas drove Isabel and Henry to school in his dusty old Chevy. Isabel sat quietly in the back seat, her backpack hugged tightly to her chest. She wore a light blue sweatshirt that had once belonged to Henry, the sleeves slightly too long, the fabric softened from time and use. Henry, trying not to act like he noticed, talked about his class, pet hamster, and the upcoming science fair. Isabel didn't respond, but her eyes flickered toward him now and then. That Thomas had learned was progress. He pulled into the school's drop-off lane and parked. Students were already pouring through the gates in waves, their backpacks bouncing, and voices blending into a morning roar of activity. Thomas turned in his seat. "You good?" he asked softly. Isabel met his gaze for a heartbeat, then gave a small, silent nod. Henry got out first, slamming the door shut with a bit too much energy. Isabel followed more carefully, stepping onto the curb like it might vanish beneath her. Thomas watched her walk away, her posture tight, but not quite shrinking. He waited until she disappeared into the crowd before pulling away. Isabel's first class was English language development, held in the smallest portable classroom behind the gym. Mrs. Davenport, a warm woman with laugh lines and paint on her cardigans, greeted her with a nod and a sticky note. "Just sit wherever you feel comfortable, sweetie." Isabel took the seat by the window. The lesson was simple. Vocabulary words with pictures, tree book, chair, window. The other students, mostly Spanish and Vietnamese speaking, whispered to each other with the ease of shared struggle. Isabel remained silent, her hands resting on her notebook untouched. At lunch, she carried her tray to the farthest bench behind the main building away from the crowded tables. She sat alone, peeling the crust off her sandwich. No one seemed to notice. Until they did. It started with two eighth-grade girls. They strutted across the yard like they owned the pavement, one of them with perfect ponytail waves, the other with designer jeans too clean for a public schoolyard. They spotted Isabel and veered toward her like predators who had just found an easy target. "What's your name?" one asked her. Tone sharp. Isabel didn't look up. "Hello, Earth," to mute girl. The other one laughed. Maybe she doesn't understand English. Or maybe she thinks she's better than us. They stopped in front of her table, casting long shadows across her tray. "Say something," the ponytail girl said, crossing her arms. Isabel stared down at her sandwich, hands frozen. Then a third voice piped in, this one, higher younger. "She doesn't have to talk to you," said Henry, standing behind them with a plastic spoon in one hand and a chocolate pudding in the other. The girls turned. "You her bodyguard or something?" one of them sneered. Henry stepped forward. "She's my friend." That word hung in the air, friend, as if it didn't quite know where it belonged. The taller girl rolled her eyes. "Whatever. Freaks." She reached for Isabel's sandwich, maybe just to mess with her, maybe to throw it. But before her hand made contact, back away. The voice didn't shout. It didn't growl. It commanded. Everyone turned. Thomas stood at the edge of the courtyard, car keys in hand, denim jacket dusty from the shop. He hadn't planned to stop by, but he'd left his thermos in the teacher's lounge after last Friday's PTA meeting. When he'd seen the girls circling Isabel, his feet had moved before his mind caught up. The girls froze like deer in headlights. "I said," Thomas repeated, walking forward, back away from her. The one with the ponytail dropped the sandwich as if it were hot coal. Thomas knelt beside Isabel, checking her face, then turned his gaze sharp as glass back to the girls. "You think it's brave to mock someone who can't fight back," he said, voice low but cutting. "Try showing up with kindness instead. That takes real courage." The courtyard had gone eerily quiet. Even the seagulls overhead seemed to hold their breath. One of the girls mumbled something, an apology maybe, and both turned and walked away, their confidence crumbling with each step. Henry moved to sit beside Isabel, protective. She didn't cry, didn't shake, but her fingers were curled so tightly into her sweatshirt that the knuckles had gone white. Thomas stayed crouched for a moment longer, just long enough to meet her eyes. "You okay?" he asked gently. No answer, but she blinked once slowly, and then gave the faintest nod. Later that evening, Thomas got a call from the school principal. The incident had been reported, policies discussed. The two girls would face disciplinary action, and Isabel was offered the option to join a peer mentorship group. Thomas thanked the principal, but politely declined the mentorship. He had a different plan. In the garage that night, Thomas dusted off an old corkboard, pinned up a paper that read, "Practice schedule," and below it, 3 simple goals. 1. Learn 1 English word a day. 2. Play 1 new song each week. 3. Speak when you feel safe, not before. He showed it to Isabel before dinner. She stared at the board for a long time, then picked up the pen beside it and slowly, carefully wrote her first word, thankful. That night, as rain pattered against the windows, Thomas sat at the edge of the couch, watching Isabel pluck the ukulele in slow, thoughtful notes. Henry leaned against his father's arm, whispering, "She didn't cry today." Thomas looked down at his son. "No," he said, "she didn't." And in that moment, the house remembered what it meant to protect, to heal, and to stand up for someone too afraid to speak. The silence wasn't gone, but it was no longer empty. It was becoming something else. The first time Thomas brought the ukulele down from the closet, it was more instinct than plan. He hadn't touched it in nearly 2 years, not since Amanda's memorial service, when Henry had asked if they'd ever hear Mommy sing again. The case had been shut since then, collecting dust on the highest shelf of their hallway closet, buried under extra linens and time. But after the scene in the schoolyard, and Isabel's quiet courage in not retreating from the world, something shifted. It wasn't just about protection anymore. It was about invitation offering her a way forward, a way to express the things words couldn't yet carry. Thomas waited until Saturday morning. The rain had passed, and a fragile sun peeked through the blinds as he set the ukulele case on the coffee table. Isabel was sitting cross-legged on the rug, paging through a children's book of animal pictures, with Henry, while Thomas brewed a fresh pot of coffee. When she noticed the case, she froze. He watched her eyes trace the outline of it, the curved wood beneath the worn leather handle, the little brass latch that clicked open with the same sound it always had. Henry whispered, "That was Mom's." Thomas nodded. She used to say it could talk better than she could some days. He opened the case slowly. The instrument still gleamed faintly, the body a warm amber, with just a few nicks along the edges, marks of life not wear. He picked it up, strummed a chord, and the sound rang out like sunlight in a dark hallway. Soft. Honest. Isabel tilted her head. "You want to try?" he asked. She didn't move at first. Then slowly she set down the book and reached out with both hands the way someone might touch a bird perched on a fence. Thomas handed her the ukulele carefully, as if passing something sacred. She rested it on her lap. Her fingers explored the strings like they were fragile alive. No sound at first, then a single note, low, uncertain. She looked up at him. Thomas smiled. "That's it." Henry jumped in. "Want me to show you the frog song I learned in music class?" "It only uses 2 chords," she didn't reply. But when Henry began plucking a sloppy, endearing version of Ribbit, Ribbit, Rain, Isabel leaned forward, watching every finger movement. She mimicked him hesitantly at first, until she hit the right rhythm. A smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Not a full smile, just a whisper of one. But for Thomas, it was enough to shift the air in the room. They made it a habit after that. Each evening after homework and dishes, Thomas would sit with Isabel and Henry in the den. He taught them the basics: chord shapes, strumming patterns, finger placement. Henry caught on quickly, his enthusiasm more plentiful than precision. Isabel was slower, more methodical, but Thomas noticed something extraordinary. She listened with her whole being. She didn't just hear the music, she absorbed it, and when she played, her fingers told stories she couldn't yet voice. One evening after 2 full weeks of practice, Isabel pointed to a picture on the music stand. "Let It Be" by the Beatles. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "You know that one." She nodded. Then she touched her chest and pointed at him. "You want me to play?" he asked. She nodded again, eyes shining. He strummed the opening chords, his voice slightly gravelly but warm. "When I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary comes to me." Isabel followed the changes, slow but steady. Her lips moved silently, mouthing the words. By the time they reached the second verse, Henry was humming along his feet, swinging off the couch. The house, once filled only with the hum of appliances and the ticking of clocks, now held music. Music that filled the gaps left by silence. Later that week, Mrs. Davenport sent home a note in Isabel's folder. "We're having a small school talent show at the end of the month. It's optional, but I thought you might be interested. No pressure at all, just an idea." Isabel's progress has been remarkable. Thomas read it twice, then looked over at Isabel, who sat at the table sketching the ukulele in a notebook. Her drawings were simple, but filled with affection, like she was trying to memorize every curve. "Mrs. Davenport thinks you're doing great," he said. She mentioned a talent show. Isabel glanced up. He didn't push, just left the note on the table and went back to stirring the soup. That night, she didn't say anything. But the next morning, the note was gone from the table, and in its place, taped gently beside the ukulele stand, was a new drawing. It showed a small girl on stage, a spotlight overhead. She had a ukulele in her hands, and though her mouth wasn't open, her eyes were full of sound. On the final page of her sketchbook that evening, Isabel wrote just one word carefully in pencil. "Sing." Thomas closed the book gently and exhaled a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying, lifting from his shoulders. She was finding her way, not because someone forced her to speak, but because someone gave her the space to be heard. By the end of October, the mornings had turned crisp and golden leaves swirled like slow confetti down the sidewalks of Bell Ridge Elementary. Isabel had been living with Thomas and Henry for just over 3 weeks, but time in her quiet presence seemed to move differently. Not faster, not slower, just deeper. Every day now she participated more. She joined Thomas and Henry at the breakfast table, occasionally sliced bananas for their cereal, and began responding to simple questions with small nods or gestures. She still hadn't spoken a full sentence, but her eyes had started to lift more often, her gaze meeting theirs without flinching. It wasn't speech, but it was communication. And in that house, a house once hollowed out by grief that meant everything. It was Thomas who first noticed the post-it notes. The first appeared on the refrigerator, a yellow square with the word milk printed in Isabel's careful handwriting. The next day, a pink one on the bathroom mirror brush. Then came school lunch and play. She was naming her world one small word at a time, not for them, for herself. By the end of the week, there were over 20 notes scattered across the house. It was as if she had taken invisible chains and turned them into labels, reclaiming what she'd once been afraid to touch. Henry naturally joined in. He added notes like awesome fart and guitar hero on every available surface. Isabel didn't always laugh out loud, but her eyes crinkled in that unmistakable way that made Thomas's chest ache in the best possible way. The ukulele practice continued too, now becoming something of a nightly ritual. Thomas introduced more complex songs, Bob Dylan, Johnny Cash, and even one of Amanda's favorite folk melodies, Simple Gifts. Henry kept his role as comic relief, but Isabel she absorbed each rhythm like a heartbeat. She still didn't sing, but she hummed, quietly, breathily, like a breeze slipping through half-closed windows. Thomas didn't rush her. He never asked her to speak or explain or perform. He only showed up with strings, with patience, with presence. And it was working. One chilly Saturday, Thomas found her in the backyard, seated on a low wooden step, with the ukulele in her lap. Her sketchbook was beside her pages, fluttering in the wind. She was drawing the tree in the corner of the yard, a gnarled old sycamore whose roots had cracked the pavement years ago. But in Isabel's version, it had wings, and the cracks looked like rivers, not flaws. He didn't interrupt. He just watched. Then quietly he said, "You know, some people think music is a kind of language." She looked up. He continued, "But I think maybe you are the language. You don't have to be loud to be heard." She blinked, once, slowly, then wrote a word on the next blank page, safe. He nodded, throat tight. "Yeah, that's what we're trying to be." The following week at school, Mrs. Davenport asked Thomas to stop by after class. Her face was lit with something close to astonishment. "Thomas," she said, leading him into her classroom after the bell rang, "I've been teaching for over 25 years. And I've never seen a child go from full silence to active, joyful engagement like this, not in 3 weeks. It's extraordinary." Thomas rubbed the back of his neck. "She's doing the hard part. I just try not to mess it up." Mrs. Davenport smiled, then leaned in. She submitted something for the writing wall. We didn't think she would, but she did. She handed him a small sheet of lined paper. At the top, in carefully penciled block letters, Isabel had written, "My name is Isabel. I play music. I have a friend. I have a home. I still miss Mama. But I am not alone now." Thomas couldn't speak for a long moment. He folded the paper carefully, like it was made of porcelain, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Later that evening, he took it out again and read it beneath the porch light, while Isabel and Henry strummed together inside. Their laughter. Yes, even Isabel's soft chuckle floated through the window. That night after Henry had gone to bed, Isabel lingered in the den, fingers still moving softly over the ukulele strings. Thomas sat on the armchair reading. The light from the floor lamp cast long, quiet shadows. After a moment, she stopped playing. He looked up. She pointed at herself, then placed a hand on her chest. Her lips moved, but there was no sound. She tried again, slower, still silent. He didn't pressure her, just set his book aside and nodded like it was enough that she wanted to say something. But then, like someone stepping over a cliff and hoping wings would appear, she whispered, "Thomas." His name. Soft. Barely formed. But it was his name. He blinked, as if afraid to break the spell. Yes, she smiled this time, fully radiantly. The kind of smile that fills a room the way sunrise fills a valley. And then she whispered, "Thank you." He couldn't respond at first. Not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't trust his voice. So he simply leaned forward, rested a hand gently on hers, and said, "You're welcome, Isabel." The silence that followed was not empty. It was earned. It was peace. And in that silence, in that shared warmth beneath a single lamp and an old ukulele, a home that had forgotten how to laugh, remembered something even better, how to listen. It began with a mistake. Mrs. Davenport hadn't meant to open Isabel's backpack, not really. The bell had rung, children were chattering and rushing past her desk, and she'd noticed Isabel had forgotten her vocabulary worksheet. Thinking quickly, she reached to tuck it inside the outer pocket before the girl ran off, but her hand brushed against something folded, worn paper, creased and fraying at the edges. Something told her to pause. Isabel was still in the doorway waiting for Henry, who'd stopped to tie his shoelace. Mrs. Davenport glanced at her, then back at the note. She gently pulled it free, intending only to glance at it, until the first line made her heart sink. "Querida mamá, te extraño cada día." Dear Mom, I miss you every day. Beneath the opening line were a series of short sentences, childlike in tone, but aching in their clarity. Each was written in both Spanish and slowly forming English, as if Isabel had been translating them herself. "I still have your bracelet. I wear it when I sleep. Mr. Thomas is nice. He does not ask questions. Henry is funny. He draws superheroes with big teeth. I don't speak much, but I play the ukulele now. Music is like your voice. It doesn't leave me. I want to be brave like you were." The last line was underlined. "Please come back soon. I am learning how to wait." Mrs. Davenport closed the note with trembling hands, tucked it gently back into the bag, and blinked fast to clear her eyes. It wasn't just language Isabel was learning. It was belonging. That evening, Thomas stood at the stove stirring chili when he noticed something different in Isabel's posture. She was at the table with her sketchbook as usual, but her shoulders were slightly raised. Her brows drawn close, not in fear, but in focus. A quiet intensity. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded but didn't look up. A minute later, she tore a page from her notebook and carried it to him without a word. Thomas wiped his hands and took it. It was a drawing, detailed, careful colored in soft pencil shades. A woman stood beside a little girl on a windy road. The girl held a ukulele. The woman had long hair pulled into a braid and wore a name tag that said, "Lucia." Between them, a distant bus. At the far end of the road was a house that looked suspiciously like theirs, slanted porchwood panels, a crooked wind chime dangling from the eave. Under the drawing was a single line written in Isabel's steady block letters. "Do you think she'll come?" Thomas stared at it for a long moment. Then slowly he crouched down to her level and met her eyes. "I don't know," he said gently. But if she does, this is the first place she'll look. Isabel's lips parted. She didn't speak, but her arms reached forward, wrapping around his neck in a swift, sudden hug. It was the first time she'd initiated one. Thomas held her back steady and warm. Later that week, during a parent-teacher conference, Mrs. Davenport told Thomas about the note she'd found. She was careful, respectful, made it clear she hadn't meant to pry. But she felt he should know. "She's pouring her heart into that paper," she said quietly. "She's writing her own bridge, one word at a time." Thomas was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you for telling me." As he walked back to his truck that night, he thought about how far Isabel had come in such a short time, and how even now she was still waiting, not just for her mother, but for something larger, certainty, safety, closure. He couldn't promise her the ending she deserved, but he could make the waiting a little less lonely. That Saturday, he built a mailbox. Not a real one, but a wooden box, with a lid and a painted sign that read, "Letters to Mama." He placed it on the corner of her desk beside her sketchbooks. When she found it, she simply opened the lid, peeked inside and looked over at him. Her eyes shimmered, but no tears fell. She picked up a pen and began to write. In the days that followed, something subtle but profound changed in Isabel. She began initiating conversations not with words always, but with gestures, post-it notes, and smiles that held meaning beyond vocabulary. She played more confidently, laughed more easily, and each night after she finished her homework, she slipped one folded paper into the mailbox. No one read them, not even Thomas. But he saw the difference they made, because healing, he realized, wasn't about undoing pain. It was about making room for it to live alongside hope. One Sunday afternoon, while Henry was at a friend's birthday party, Thomas and Isabel drove to the farmer's market. The autumn air was brisk, the scent of cider and kettle corn floating on the breeze. Musicians played on the corner, their fiddles and banjos weaving joy into the crowds. Isabel lingered by a stall where a woman sold handmade bracelets. Her fingers touched a thin strand of braided leather, almost identical to the one she wore on her wrist, her mother's. The vendor smiled. "You like that one?" Isabel nodded. Thomas stepped forward and quietly paid. As they walked back to the truck, she slipped the new bracelet into the side pocket of her coat. "For Mama?" Thomas asked gently. Isabel nodded again, then with quiet clarity said, "When she comes." Thomas swallowed. "We'll give it to her together." She reached over, laced her fingers with his, and they walked the rest of the way hand in hand. No more words were needed. That night, as Thomas tucked her in, she whispered again. This time, not his name, but a sentence. Soft. Brave. "I think I belong now." Thomas sat on the edge of the bed, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "You always did," he said. And for the first time since the day she arrived, Isabel fell asleep, not clutching her sketchbook, but smiling into her pillow, knowing that even if her world wasn't whole, yet it was real. And it was hers. It was a Tuesday when she came. The wind had shifted that morning, no longer the crisp, golden rustle of early fall, but something colder, edged with the whisper of winter. Thomas had just returned from the grocery store when he noticed the unfamiliar car parked along the curb, a forest green sedan with Texas plates and a small stuffed bear hanging from the rearview mirror. He didn't think much of it at first, until he saw the woman standing at the porch. She wasn't knocking. She was just waiting. Tall, early 30s, with dark curls pulled into a neat twist and a coat cinched at the waist. There was something elegant about her stance, like someone who wasn't easily shaken. But in her hands, she held a weathered red leather book cradled like something precious. Isabel wasn't home yet. She and Henry were staying late for art club. Thomas stepped out of the truck, closed the door, and walked slowly toward the porch. The woman turned at the sound of his boots on gravel. Her eyes were unmistakable. Not in their color, they were a soft hazel different from Isabel's rich brown, but in their expression. That quiet intensity. That silent question. "Can I help you?" Thomas asked, already knowing the answer. "I'm Lucia," she said. Her voice had a musical cadence to it, warm but clear. "I believe you've been taking care of my cousin's daughter." Thomas nodded. "Isabel." She smiled softly at the name. "Yes." They stood in a moment of silence. Then Lucia held up the book. This belonged to Isabel's mama, a recipe journal. She kept it with her for years, passed it to me before she was taken. Thomas opened the screen door. "Come in." They sat in the kitchen, the leather-bound recipe book lying open between them. Its pages were stained, the corners curled with age, and the handwriting, a beautiful flowing script, danced across every line. There were notes in Spanish, tiny drawings of herbs and vegetables in the margins. One recipe had a smudge of flour over the word canela cinnamon. She used to bake empanadas at dawn, Lucia said. Said it made the house smell like childhood. Thomas listened, stirring a fresh pot of coffee on the stove. She was working a cleaning job when they picked her up. Lucia continued. "ICE held her for over a week before anyone contacted me. I've been trying to get her case processed, but..." She sighed. "There's no timeline, just red tape and empty promises." Thomas passed her a mug. "Does Isabel know she knows something?" "But not enough. I didn't want to give her hope unless I had something real." Lucia traced the edge of the book with her finger. "Then last week I got word. They've moved her to a family reunification center near San Diego. She's still not cleared, but they're starting the process." Thomas's heart caught mid-beat. Isabel's mother is alive. Lucia nodded, exhausted, scared, but alive. The sound of the school bus brought them both to their feet. Through the front window, they saw Henry hop down, Isabel trailing behind her backpack, slightly unzipped, a drawing peeking out. Lucia stepped back. "Should I stay?" Thomas said. "She deserves this moment." The door creaked open. "Hey, kiddo," Thomas said gently. Isabel stepped in, pausing as she saw Lucia. Her eyes widened. She didn't run, didn't cry, just stood very still, lips slightly parted. Lucia crouched down, slow and steady. "Hola, mi niña," she said softly. "You remember me?" Isabel blinked. Then with a tiny nod, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Lucia's neck. It wasn't a dramatic embrace, no wails, no trembling. Just a quiet, complete connection. The kind that says I've waited a long time for this without needing to say a word. That evening they cooked together. Lucia pulled out ingredients from the bags Thomas had brought: cornmeal, cheese, cumin, cinnamon, even a small bag of fresh guavas. She laid the recipe journal open on the counter and handed Isabel a wooden spoon. They worked side by side, Lucia, Thomas, Henry, and Isabel, in a rhythm that felt strangely familiar, like a song none of them had ever heard, but somehow knew. Lucia laughed when Henry mispronounced queso fresco. Thomas rolled out dough with a wine bottle, mumbling something about improvising like a real chef. Isabel didn't speak much, but her hands moved with growing confidence, and she hummed under her breath. When they sat down to eat, Thomas looked around the table. It felt full, not in a noisy way, not in a crowded way, but in a complete way. After dinner, Lucia and Thomas stood on the porch while the kids cleaned up inside. "She's changed," Lucia said quietly. "She's healing," Thomas replied. "You've done more than I could have asked." He shook his head. "She did the hard work." Lucia smiled. "Still, you gave her a place to grow roots." There was a pause. Then Lucia said, "When her mother's released, Isabel will need to make a decision. Go back with her mama or stay here," Thomas finished. Lucia nodded. "It won't be easy, but it'll be hers to make. Thomas looked out at the quiet street. He thought about the silence when Isabel first arrived, the guarded eyes, the absence of laughter, and then he thought about her first note, her first smile the first time she whispered his name. He wasn't ready to let go, but he would, if that's what she needed. She'll know where she belongs, he said. Lucia's gaze softened. Yes, she will. That night, as Thomas passed by Isabel's room, he noticed her door was slightly ajar. She was sitting cross-legged on the bed, flipping through the recipe journal. Her fingers traced the flour-smudged page. When she looked up and saw him, she lifted the book. "Mamas," she said softly. Her voice, so rare, so sacred, carried both joy and grief in equal measure. Thomas nodded. "She'd be proud of you." Isabel smiled. Then, pointing at the journal, she whispered, "Can we make this one tomorrow?" He stepped inside. "Only if you promise to teach me." She grinned, a full, unguarded grin that reached all the way to her eyes. And for the first time since the day she arrived, Isabel didn't feel like someone passing through a storm. She felt like someone planting roots in the middle of it. The flyer had been taped to the school bulletin board for weeks. Fall Talent Show, Friday. November 17th, sign up in the main office. Most students walked past it without a second glance, but Isabel noticed. She didn't say anything at first. Just stood by the board a little longer than usual, her fingers brushing lightly over the edge of the paper, as if the letters were written in Braille only she could read. That afternoon, as they walked home, Henry kicked at a pine cone and said casually, "I'm doing stand-up comedy. Just 3 jokes, but they're good. One's about squirrels. Want to hear?" Isabel nodded. He told the joke. She giggled. Then she hesitated, pulled a folded paper from her backpack, and handed it to him. Henry unfolded it. On it was a sketch of a stage, a ukulele drawn carefully in the center, and a small girl behind the mic. Above it was a single question. "Should I?" Henry didn't even pause. "Yes," he said. "Definitely. Yes." That evening, Isabel slid the flyer across the dinner table toward Thomas. She didn't say anything, just tapped the date. He looked at her, then at the flyer, then back to her. "You want to audition?" he asked. She nodded. Slowly, his heart thumped, not out of worry, but out of wonder. "You sure?" She nodded again, then whispered, "It's time." The school gym had been transformed for auditions. A small stage at one end, rows of folding chairs facing forward, a portable speaker system humming gently near the bleachers. Mrs. Davenport stood near the entrance with a clipboard, calling names. Isabel waited at the back of the room, her ukulele. In its case, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She wasn't the only one nervous. A boy forgot the lyrics to his pop song halfway through. A girl in pigtails played Twinkle, Twinkle on a recorder, while her dad mouthed the notes from the audience. There were dance routines, magic tricks, even a duet of "You Are My Sunshine," sung off-key by 2 first graders. Then Mrs. Davenport looked up and called Isabel Mendez. Isabel froze. Thomas leaned down. "You've got this," he whispered. "No matter what happens, you're already amazing." She stood slowly, her knees wobbling. The room seemed bigger than it had a moment before, the lights brighter. Her hand sweat through the handle of her case. As she walked toward the stage, someone in the audience snickered. "Isn't that the girl who never talks?" Thomas heard it. So did Henry. But Isabel didn't flinch. She reached the microphone, set the ukulele gently against her chest, and breathed in. The silence in the gym was palpable, the kind that creeps in before something sacred. Even Mrs. Davenport looked up from her clipboard. Isabel positioned her fingers and strummed the first chord. Then another. It was the opening to Let It Be. Her rhythm was steady, her hands confident. The notes rang true, sweet and full. Then just when everyone thought it would be another quiet instrumental, she sang. Soft, almost a whisper, but clear. When I find myself in times of trouble. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some of the same students who had once called her mute now sat slack-jawed in their chairs. Mother Mary comes to me speaking words of wisdom. Her voice grew stronger with each line carried by something deeper than volume. It carried longing, courage, hope. Let it be. Let it be. By the second verse, a teacher near the front dabbed her eyes with a tissue. A boy who had shoved Isabel in the lunch line weeks ago stared at the floor, shame flickering across his face. And when she reached the final chorus, the gym was completely still. No one breathed. No one moved. Even the lights seemed to hold their breath. Then it ended. A final strum. A pause. Isabel looked up. Her eyes shimmered not with fear, but with the fragile joy of someone who had finally said what needed to be said. And the gym, slowly, then thunderously erupted. Applause, whistles, cheers. Thomas was on his feet. Henry, too, both clapping like they were trying to send her into orbit. Mrs. Davenport dropped her clipboard. One teacher leaned toward another and whispered. She found her voice. Afterward, Isabel stepped off the stage breathless. She walked straight to Thomas and Henry, who enveloped her in a hug so big her ukulele nearly dropped. "You were incredible," Thomas said, voice thick. Henry beamed. "Can I be your manager?" Isabel laughed a real unguarded laugh and wiped a tear from her cheek. Then she reached into her pocket and handed Thomas a note. This was for Mom. "But I sang it with your heart." He read it twice, then again. He couldn't speak, so he did the only thing that felt true. He wrapped her in his arms and held her tight, while the applause still echoed in his ears, and the gym, once the place she feared most, became the room where she became whole. That night, Thomas lit a candle on the porch, an old tradition from Amanda's days, a way of honoring breakthroughs both spoken and unspoken. Isabel sat beside him, her sketchbook open on her knees. She drew the stage, the lights, the people, herself. But in this version, she stood with open arms and a tiny heart floating from her mouth like a note. When she finished, she added 3 words underneath. I sang free. Thomas looked at the page, then at her, and whispered, "You always were." The call came on a Wednesday. It was late afternoon, and Thomas was outside stacking firewood for the approaching winter, while Henry did his homework inside. Isabel was sitting under the sycamore tree, in the backyard, legs tucked beneath her, strumming soft melodies on the ukulele. Nothing in particular, just the music of a girl, finally at ease with silence. The house phone rang. Thomas nearly didn't hear it over the rhythmic thud of logs on the pile. He wiped his hands on his jeans, stepped inside, and grabbed the receiver just before the 4th ring. Hello. There was a pause. Then a voice, calm but serious. Mr. Thomas Lorne speaking. "This is Officer Ramirez from the Department of Family Reunification Services in San Diego. I'm calling regarding Maria Mendez." Thomas straightened. His heart thudded. "Yes, she's been processed and cleared for supervised release. She'll be eligible for reunification with her daughter within the next 2 weeks. He froze. "You're saying Isabel's mother is coming home?" "Yes, we're coordinating her travel and temporary housing. Ms. Lucia Mendez listed your address as Isabel's current residence. We'll need your confirmation to proceed." Thomas swallowed hard. "You have it. Thank you, Mr. Lorne. We'll be in touch with the exact date." The line disconnected. Thomas stood still, the dial tone humming in his ear like a distant siren. The world hadn't tilted, but it felt like it had. Isabel's mother was coming back, and that changed everything. He didn't tell Isabel right away, not because he wanted to withhold it, but because he didn't know how to say it. How do you tell a child that the life she's only just begun to love may not be hers to keep? That night, as he stirred beef stew on the stove, Isabel came into the kitchen, humming "Let It Be," and handed him a note. "Can we decorate for Christmas this weekend?" Thomas smiled and nodded, though his chest ached. Of course. Henry bounded into the room. "Let's put the tree up early." Mom always said, the longer the lights are up, the longer the joy stays. Thomas felt Amanda's memory settle around them like a warm blanket. He looked at Isabel, who was laughing quietly at Henry's excitement. And he realized then, this wasn't just a house anymore. It was a home. The next morning, Lucia called. "I just heard," she said. "They called me too." "Yeah," Thomas said, sipping cold coffee. "It's good news." "It is," Lucia said gently. "But it's also hard." Thomas leaned against the counter, rubbing his temple. "She's her mother. That's not a question." "No." Lucia agreed. "But you're her heart now. That matters too." There was silence on the line, filled with the weight of unspoken truths. "She'll have to choose," Thomas said softly. Yes. 3 days later, Isabel found out. She and Henry were in the den stringing popcorn garlands, while an old Bing Crosby Christmas album played softly on vinyl. Thomas sat in the adjacent chair, flipping through the recipe journal Lucia had left behind. "Hey, Dad," Henry said. Suddenly, is Isabel's mom still in that center? Thomas looked up. Isabel froze. Thomas set the journal down. "She's not." She turned toward him, slowly, eyes wide. "She's been cleared," he said gently. "They're working on getting her back to California." The ukulele slid off her lap, landing softly on the rug. "She's coming," Thomas nodded. "In about 2 weeks." Isabel's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Then, after a pause, she whispered, "Does that mean I leave Thomas's heart cracked?" He stood, knelt in front of her. "No one's making you do anything, Isabel. You'll always have a place here. This is your home, too." Tears welled in her eyes. "But I want both," she whispered. "I want everything." Thomas nodded, voice tight. "I know, sweetheart." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a tiny wooden ornament, a music note carved from cedar. "Then maybe," he said, pressing it into her palm, "we start by making a Christmas with everything in it." The days that followed were tender. Not sad exactly, but thick with emotion. Isabel was quieter, more thoughtful. She still practiced music, still smiled, still helped Henry tape paper snowflakes to the windows. But now there was a distant look in her eyes, like she was standing between 2 doors she wasn't ready to open. One night, she sat beside Thomas on the porch swing, wrapped in her flannel blanket, watching the stars blink into view. She held the cedar ornament in one hand, her sketchbook open in the other. "I'm scared," she whispered. Thomas looked over. "Of what?" She hesitated. Then, "If I go with Mama, I'll miss you. If I stayed, I'll miss her." He nodded slowly. "I don't want to break my heart again," she added, her voice barely audible. Thomas took a deep breath. "You won't break it, Isabel. You'll stretch it." She looked at him confused. "Love doesn't split," he said. "It expands. It makes room. It hurts sometimes, but it's worth it." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they watched the sky together. A week later, they received the official date, December 14th. Her mother would be released and brought to a transitional home near San Diego. Isabel could stay overnight, or choose to reunify full-time. It would be her decision. Thomas gave her the letter. She read it silently, then pulled out a fresh page in her notebook. "Things I love, Thomas. Henry, Mama, music, pancakes, trees, my voice, my home. I don't want to lose anything. Please let me choose yes to all." That night, as the fire crackled, and Bing Crosby crooned softly in the background, Isabel looked up at Thomas and said the most courageous sentence she'd ever spoken. "I want to visit her, but I want to come back here. Can I have 2 homes?" Thomas knelt beside her. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He said what mattered most. "You already do." The first snow arrived early that year. It came quietly like a secret whispered across the rooftops while the town slept. By morning, the world outside the Lorne house was blanketed in white. Trees stood still beneath their powdered coats, and the sky hung low, soft, and gray, like wool pulled over the edges of the horizon. Henry was the first to see it. He burst into Thomas's room barefoot and wild-eyed. It snowed. It really snowed. Thomas sat up, groggily rubbing the sleep from his face. "Already, I told you." Henry grinned. "I felt it in the air last night." Down the hall, Isabel stood at her window, one hand pressed against the glass. She wasn't smiling, not quite, but her eyes shimmered. This was her first snow in California. Her first snow in a home that still surprised her every morning by simply staying. She had known too many places that disappeared. But this one had become hers. By noon, the backyard was a canvas of footprints and snow angels. Isabel bundled in Henry's spare coat and mismatched gloves, held the old sled while Henry pushed from behind. They tumbled through the powder, shrieking with laughter, cheeks flushed. Thomas watched from the kitchen window, coffee in hand, a content smile stretching beneath his beard. Lucia arrived later that afternoon, her cheeks red from the cold and her arms full of groceries. She stepped inside and was immediately greeted by the smell of cinnamon and the sound of Isabel humming from the living room. "I brought ingredients for the tamales," she said. "Your stove ready, always," Thomas replied. Cooking became an all-hands-on-deck production. Isabel folded corn husks with delicate precision. Henry grated cheese with great enthusiasm and greater mess. Lucia floated between them, calm and methodical, the recipe journal open on the counter like scripture. Thomas sautéed onions and garlic, stirring slowly, letting the aroma fill the house. It didn't feel like preparing a meal. It felt like building a memory. After dinner, as snow continued to fall outside, they gathered in the den. The fire crackled, the tree sparkled, and music drifted gently from the old record player. Isabel sat with her ukulele fingers picking out a soft tune, something new, something hers. Thomas played guitar beside her, keeping pace with ease. Henry banged a tambourine off-beat, earning playful groans from the grown-ups. Lucia watched from the armchair, her eyes misty. "You know," she said quietly, "I think your mama would cry if she saw this." Isabel paused, her hand resting gently on the strings. "She will," she whispered. "When she comes." Thomas's heart twisted in his chest, but not from sadness, from awe. Because the girl who once couldn't speak was now speaking for everyone. The night before, Isabel was to travel to San Diego for the reunion visit. She knocked on Thomas's door. It was nearly 10 p.m. He opened it to find her in her pajamas, clutching a small wrapped package. "I made you something," she said. He stepped aside to let her in, surprised. She placed the gift on his nightstand. "Don't open it until I leave tomorrow." Thomas smiled. "All right." She hesitated. "I'll only be gone 3 days, but I think I'll miss here." Thomas knelt to meet her eyes. "We'll miss you too." "I'm not running away," she added quickly. "I just need to see her face." "I know," he said. "And she needs to see yours." Isabel threw her arms around his neck. No fear this time. No hesitation. Just love. They left early the next morning. Lucia drove. Thomas stood on the porch as Isabel climbed into the car. Before the door shut, she turned around. "Will you keep the porch light on, always?" he said. She nodded. then pulled something from her coat pocket and tossed it to him. It was the cedar ornament, the one she'd carved the words I sang free into. For the tree, she called out. Then the door closed, and the car pulled away. The house was quieter without her. Not empty, but quieter. Thomas found himself reaching for 2 plates at lunch instead of 1. Henry sat longer in her chair at the table, as if holding space. 3 days passed slowly. On the 4th morning they returned. Lucia stepped out of the car first, then Isabel. She walked toward Thomas, snowflakes catching in her hair, a tiny suitcase in one hand. When she reached the porch, she stopped, then looked up. "I told Mama," she said. "Everything." Thomas's throat tightened. And she said. Isabel took a deep breath. She said, "Sometimes love means sharing." She said, "I can stay if that's what I want." Thomas stared at her, then dropped to one knee. "What do you want, Isabel?" She didn't hesitate. "I want both. But this is where my roots are." He smiled, blinking fast. "Then welcome home." That night, the Christmas tree glowed golden in the corner of the den. The cedar ornament hung front and center. Beneath it, a new addition, a hand-drawn card with a single word in Isabel's handwriting. "Stay." As snow drifted quietly past the window, and Henry snored softly from the couch, Isabel curled up in her old spot beside the fire, her ukulele in hand. She strummed a melody, then sang clear, steady. Not for an audience, not for applause, but because the house had learned how to listen. And she had finally learned how to belong. The living room glowed with soft golden light. Outside, the last snow of December settled over the yard like a final hush before the new year. The wind had quieted. The trees stood still. Inside the Lorne house, everything felt warm, like a breath held just long enough to remember it. The fireplace crackled. A pine-scented candle flickered gently beside the couch, and in the center of it all, Isabel stood beside the small wooden stage. Thomas and Henry had built that afternoon. 3 crates, stacked and nailed together, covered with a plaid blanket. Their own stage, their own concert. A Christmas Eve tradition, newly born. "Ready?" Thomas asked softly. Isabel looked out across the living room. Lucia sat on the armchair beside Amanda's old Afghan hands, wrapped around a mug of cinnamon tea. Henry bounced on the edge of the couch, wearing a crooked paper crown. And in the far corner, a laptop sat open, video call connected, showing the smiling, tear-brimmed face of Maria Mendez, Isabel's mother, watching from a family home in San Diego. "See," Isabel whispered. "I'm ready." She adjusted the strap of her ukulele, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first notes were familiar, gentle, slow. Silent night. Holy night. Her voice filled the room, not loudly but fully, as if each word had waited months to come out in the open, and now that they had, they refused to hide again. It was the voice of a girl who had once sat silently on a porch step, afraid to even meet a stranger's eyes. Now she was leading her family. 2 houses, 3 names, 1 story. Through a song that had outlived wars, winters, and the weight of sorrow. Lucia wiped her eyes. Maria on the screen held her hands to her chest, and Thomas, standing behind the camera, felt a lump rise in his throat he didn't try to fight. When the song ended, there was no immediate applause, just stillness. Then Henry blurted, "Can we do one more?" Everyone laughed. Isabel smiled wider than ever before. One more. They sang into the night. Carols and folk songs. One silly jingle Henry made up about reindeer who couldn't spell. Even Amanda's favorite, The Parting Glass, which Thomas sang quietly, his voice shaking just enough to make it beautiful. When the last note faded, they sat together on the rug, sipping cocoa and nibbling sugar cookies. Isabel leaned against Thomas's shoulder, her head light from laughter. You know, Lucia said some houses echo. But this one sings. Thomas looked around the room. Every corner held a memory. Amanda's framed recipe cards, Henry's science fair trophy on the shelf, the pine cone ornament Isabel made with her name carved in it, dangling proudly from the tree. A house full of old grief, now full of new life. I think Thomas said slowly, it just needed a reason to sing again. Later that night when the kids were in bed and Lucia had gone to her room, Thomas stepped out onto the porch. Snowflakes swirled gently beneath the yellow porch light. He sat on the swing, an old blanket draped across his lap, and opened the cedar notebook he'd begun keeping since Isabel's arrival. He flipped through pages filled with scribbled music chords, grocery lists, therapy notes, and drawings she'd tucked between the pages. On the final page he wrote, "This house remembered how to sing, because she taught it how to listen." And love came back not in the form we expected, but in the form we needed. She made us whole. He closed the journal and leaned back. A moment later, the door creaked open. Isabel stepped outside wrapped in her thickest sweater hair messy from sleep. "I knew you'd be here," she said, smiling. He scooted over. She sat beside him, curling into his side. "The stars look happy tonight," she whispered. He looked up. "Yeah. I think they're singing, too." They sat together in silence, the kind only families can share, the kind made not from absence, but from presence. After a while, Isabel reached into her sweater pocket and handed him a small paper folded twice. Thomas opened it. It was a sketch, him, Isabel, Henry, Lucia, and Maria all around a table. No one's mouth was open, but every figure had music notes drawn over their hearts. Above them a banner that read, "Two homes, one song." Thomas felt something in his chest shift, an ache turning into warmth. "She'll come for New Year," Isabel said. "Mama, just for a day. She said she wants to see the house that made me brave." Thomas swallowed hard. "She's welcome," he said. "Always." Isabel looked up at him. "Me too." He didn't answer right away. He just pulled her close, kissed the top of her head, and said, "You were always meant to stay." Inside, the record player spun its final track. The fireplace hissed, and somewhere in the deep of night, the house exhaled grateful. Not for perfection, not for certainty, but for belonging, because the house that had once fallen silent now sang every time someone whispered, "Welcome home." If this story touched your heart, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? It's always moving to see how far kindness can travel, and your comments help bring this little storytelling community even closer. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this about love, second chances, and quiet miracles, feel free to subscribe. No pressure, just a warm invitation. Thank you truly for spending your time here with us. Until next time, take care of yourself and take care of each other.